Welcome back to my channel if you've been here before. If you haven't, then I'm Gemma, I talk about books, and this is the second part of my September wrap-up. So I explained in my previous video that I was doing this in two parts because September wasn't a brilliant reading month for me. I DNF'd 3 books, and if you haven't seen the previous video and you want to know what they are, then I will link it below and you can see which books I started that didn't get on with and why I decided to DNF them. In this video, I'm going to talk about the books that I did actually finish. So I read 1 non-fiction, 1 novella, 1 short story collection, and 2 novels. So first up, the non-fiction that I read was The Witches by Tracy Borman, and this book was okay. I didn't love it, and the reason I didn't love it is because it wasn't actually what I thought it was going to be about. The synopsis kind of gave the impression that it was going to be about a particular group of people based at a particular place in a particular time period. And to a certain extent it was, but what the author actually did was use that as a starting point to talk about a much wider topic, which was essentially how women were treated if they were suspected of witchcraft. This was right across Britain during the reign of James I, which I can't remember his dates, and there was just a lot of information in this book. So this is very much a historical non-fiction, and if I'm completely honest, I just found the writing very, very dry and very information heavy. There were a lot of sightings and references to other people's works and quotes by other people and historical quotes and information, which was interesting, but it made for a very fact-heavy read, if that makes sense. I know this is a non-fiction, so you expect that, but I also like there to be information about people and places, and when all it is just dates and historical references one after the other after the other after the other, it just becomes a bit much. And I really wanted this book to just focus in more on a particular group of people rather than random people across the country. I don't know if I'm explaining this very well. I just didn't enjoy this as much as I'd hoped I would. I was kind of a little bit disappointed. I was just hoping for a bit of a lighter read, and this really wasn't what I got. So the novella that I read was The Cycle of the Werewolf by Stephen King, and werewolves really aren't my thing. They're not a topic that I go for generally at all, but I am reading Stephen King in chronological order, and this was the next book in line. And if I'm honest, I really enjoyed it. It's very simple in that it's 12 tiny little stories, all based around a werewolf that is terrorising a very small community over the course of a year. And so we have 12 events that take place, 1 each month, and there is a running theme. So all the characters are obviously all in the same place, they all know each other, and it was just really fun. It was a really quick read. I did read this in 2 sittings because I read it just before I went to bed, 2 nights running. But I just really enjoyed it. There was real humour to the story, but also, even though it was very short and the events of each attack were very simply told, Stephen King still managed to do what he does really well, which is create this small town community full of memorable characters. And also, it's a really well illustrated story. I don't have the book with me, so I can't remember the name of the illustrator, but some of the pictures were absolutely brilliant. But it's just a really fun story. It's a bit gory. It's not scary, although there are a couple of little incidents that might make you flinch a little bit. But I actually think that was more to do with the illustrations in this book than anything. But I really enjoyed it. For a short story about werewolves, which is usually not my thing, I really liked it. So then the short story collection that I read was the number 121 to Pennsylvania and Other Stories by Keelan Patrick Burke. Now, I've talked about this author a few times. He's one that is just becoming a bit of an auto-buy for me. I really enjoy his novellas and short stories. He's an author who is just really good at creating characters and a location in his stories. He's also a writer who can write a really good short story that's basically sort of punch in the face and gets your attention. These stories, none of them really stood out to me as being absolutely brilliant or not very good. They were all just kind of, okay, I enjoyed them at the time. So for a collection, it was, which is a bit weird because normally when I read a collection, I loved some stories, I really didn't like others. So it was a bit unusual to read a collection and just have an okay opinion on nearly every story. But he's definitely a writer who I enjoy. I love that he injects humour into his stories. And as I say, he's just really great at creating characters and a real sense of place. And that's something that I really love. So then, as I said, I read 2 novels. So the first one I read was Hide by Kirsten White. Now, I know that this has had some very good reviews and some very poor reviews. I'm kind of a bit more on the I enjoyed it scale, but I definitely didn't love it. I think the biggest problem for me with this book was that it was marketed as being an adult horror, and it's not. It's definitely more geared towards young adults. The majority of the characters in this book are sort of early 20s, but the writing style is very young. It felt very basic. The plot I found really intriguing. So the basic premise of this book is that a random group of people, all in their sort of early 20s, have been randomly selected to go and play what is essentially a game of hide and seek in an abandoned amusement park. And at the end of each day, 2 players get selected and kicked out of the game. If they are found, they're kicked out until there is a winner. What they don't know is that if you are found, you are killed. So it's hide and seek, but with death as a consequence if you're found. So the mystery in this story is, how were they chosen? Why were they picked to play the game? And what is the meaning behind the game? So the people who created the game, what was their ultimate aim? And I have to say, I didn't love the logic behind this. It's kind of a bit of social commentary on young people and the sort of invisible fight there is between generations. And I think this is where the problem came. I think it could have been brilliantly done if it had been actually marketed at young adults, then it would have resonated more. However, because it was marketed as being for adults, I think it just missed the mark. It wasn't scary. There were some atmospheric moments in this, but it just wasn't scary enough. There wasn't enough feeling of danger and impending doom. There were also a lot of characters in this book. However, the one thing that I did think was very clever that the author did was, even though we have multiple POVs in this book, she does essentially give us a main character. And this main character, whose name I cannot remember off the top of my head, is not very sociable. She doesn't have any friends. She's not very good at making friends. And so she makes no real attempt to get to know people. So she can't always remember people's names. So she basically explains to the reader that she can't remember all of the characters who are surrounding her. As certain people drop out of the game, she says, well, I can't remember them, and she describes them, and she essentially just talks about them by their looks and their characteristics, which kind of gives the reader permission to not remember all of the characters, because there are a lot, and we're kind of encouraged to not get to know them all, because clearly they're not going to last. They're not going to make it to the end. So I didn't mind that. I thought that was actually quite a clever workaround to say, you know what, you're not going to remember all these characters, but it's fine, because the main character that you're following can't remember them either. So I quite liked that. I thought that was a slightly humorous, clever way of saying, you know what, there's a lot of people and a lot of stuff going on in this book, but it's okay if you lose track a little bit. But as I say, I wasn't a massive fan of the kind of concluding reason behind the events and behind why the things that were happening. I did think that the characterizations were quite good. There were some nice elements with relationships between the characters. There is queer representation. There was some mild homophobia, but that was kind of dealt with in the book. So it was clearly there to give characters the opportunity to call out the other characters. So it wasn't just offensive language to be offensive. It was there for the other characters to really stand up for themselves and for others, and to be inclusive and defensive. And I quite liked that. I can understand if maybe some people don't like that and they just don't feel the need for it at all. But I quite liked that in terms of the characters getting to know each other and developing their friendships and their relationships. In terms of it being a horror though, it just wasn't there for me. It wasn't as scary as I think it could have been and should have been. And it was okay as a mild thriller, but I definitely wouldn't describe this as a horror book. And then the final book that I read in September was Hangs a Man by Shirley Jackson. And this is a really weird one. But then it's Shirley Jackson, so I don't expect anything else from her anymore. The only way I can really describe this book is as though it's a mix between one of her other novels, The Bird's Nest, and The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. It's essentially the story of a young woman who leaves home to go to university. She has a very strange relationship with her father in that he is obsessively controlling over her and very dismissive, mildly insulting when it comes to her interests and her achievements. He is a writer, but I kind of got the feeling that he just never quite achieved what he set out to achieve. And he clearly realises and identifies that his daughter has got some talent and he's jealous. And he just puts her down constantly. Once she goes to university, they interact only really in letters. And all of his letters to her are basically insulting her writing and her grammar and the way she presents herself. And so she is this young woman who essentially has little to no confidence. She's very few social skills, really doesn't know how to interact with the people around her, and struggles to make friends and be part of that sort of university community. But then when she does interact with people, she kind of has her dad's mentality that she can also be very judgmental about other people. But because everything is from her point of view, it's quite difficult to know whether or not the people around her are actually as she makes out they are, or whether it's all just because of this slightly clouded objectivity that she's sort of inherited from her father. But like the other two books that I mentioned, there's a real sense that she is an unreliable narrator. She's clearly struggling with sort of mental health issues. There are references to suicide through this book. So if that is something that you find triggering, then you might want to consider avoiding it. It's just an interesting outlook on a young woman's experiences after leaving home and her parents, and just how she's going to live next. So the battery on my camera is about to run out because it's flashing at me. So they're the books that I read in September. Please let me know what you read, what was your favourite book, and like, comment, subscribe, and I will be back with another video soon. Bye!